Earth is no longer a haven for humanity, travel between planets has become commonplace, and technology can now replace flesh and blood. It's all for the Empire. For the sake of the Emperor and his people, it was simply necessary to destroy any threat. This was the only purpose for existence. Everyone in the Imperial Guard understood this and lived by all the necessary rules and laws. The Imperial Guard spared no one, and each of its members killed and did not even regret it. Everyone there followed all orders unconditionally. All members of the Imperial Guard were very strong and specially trained with a program that could teach them everything there was to know about this cruel world. The Earth of the future, where only technology was significantly developed. However, there was no hope for them. Due to the endless war caused by the lack of resources, the Earth continued to be torn apart. As a result, humanity was forced to move to completely different planets. Life on Earth has come to an end, as a result of the invasion of alien creatures. However, the surviving part of humanity continued to roam the vastness of space, and finally, after many years of wandering, they found a planet similar to Earth. Humanity decided to call it Novus, meaning new home. They sent word across space to other survivors, giving them the coordinates of their new home, and so, scattered humans across the galaxy began to gather on Novus. Belato Federation, a completely free federation for humans and other species. The Empire of Acrisius. This land has a powerful and efficient army of soldiers. Holy Alliance of Kora, a nation of believers who possess powerful energy in a heap with mental fortitude. Novus's resources were not unlimited either, because of which humanity has once again begun to prepare for war. This war is for the monopolization of resources. Empire of Acrisius, Machine Laboratory, Introduction to the main character. His commander considered himself extremely unlucky, because now he will be compared to everyone. But to avoid this, the main character had to show His Majesty everything he was capable of. So it was worth remembering that this was an extremely important stage of training. Gemellus Castoria is the commander of the Imperial Guard of Acrisia. Luca is the main character and a trainee in the Imperial Guard. He believed that he was bound to get lucky. The commander would remember his name and said that he had better live up to his expectations. Luca was ready to show his abilities. From the moment he joined the Guard, Luca knew that he had to at least block or dodge all attacks. This is the most necessary skill for someone who wants to officially join the Imperial Guard. Luca has been through all the training, the simulation of emergency situations. Luca is the trainee of this Imperial Guard with the deepest understanding of space, thanks to his senses and the perception enhancement procedure he underwent. He will be able to overcome absolutely everything, thanks to his perseverance and desire to do everything for the good of the Empire. And right now, his opponents were 5 suicide bombers in cheap cybernetic gear. Defeating them shouldn't take too long, about 10 seconds. Destroying these people was Luke's new mission. He destroyed everyone who was there one by one. However, this mission was a good opportunity to make a glorious impression on the Emperor. Luke must distinguish himself. But the problem was that the main character didn't quite understand how to do this. Luca had never tried anything like this before, but he had to cope with it no matter what. Luca decided to push his feelings to the max. He will do everything to make people proud of him. When the 10 seconds were up, Luca suddenly realized that it was all over and he had just outdone himself. This victory should have definitely increased his value. Commander Castoria had no idea that this guy was using projectile trajectory control. It was never in the curriculum. In fact, Luca was simply able to copy the one in front of him. The commander noticed that the guy was from a famous family. He must have been trained in all this beforehand. He was different from orphans like Luca in many ways. The commander really liked Luca and decided to give him a gift. This is something the main character definitely did not expect. But first the commander decided to check something. The guys from his squad watched what was to follow. The commander tested everyone who, in his opinion, was stronger in spirit and braver than anyone else. Luca didn't even flinch. The thing is, he was honing his pain tolerance training, and that's what the commander wanted to test. The commander liked it very much, but Luca was truly glad that he was able to be appreciated so well. He was also glad that his eye was gone. He would have removed it anyway. Luca had always wanted eyes with trajectory prediction. Later, the main character had the opportunity to meet Ailey. He was number 12 in the guard. Ailey wanted to talk to Luca, and he was number 32 in this guard. But Ailey came too suddenly, so he even bothered to apologize. Luke would have invited him inside anyway. Elias thought he had done a fantastic job. Everyone was amazed. Luca would not accept any form of praise. He informed the young gentleman that if he wanted to exchange praise, he had come to the wrong place. The gentleman realized that it was not so easy to befriend Luca, but he should have immediately understood from his aura that before him was a representative of the noble aristocrats of the Karfik family. Logically, it was not at all advantageous for Luca to be insolent to a representative of noble blood. Perhaps he was simply jealous, but it was best to simply say that he was very tired. In fact, Aili came not only to befriend him, but also to give him something very useful in his current state. It was a pill that was able to dull the sensitivity a little, but this way he would be able to rest better. Luca immediately refused this, but Aili was sure that Luca would not be able to train properly tomorrow if he did not rest properly. He himself should have understood that it was impossible to get far on mental fortitude alone. Luca knew that this medicine was much different from those made on the streets. He praised Aili in return for his good work and informed him that he simply copied his actions. Well, Aili had combat mechanical eyes, so it wasn't hard for him to calculate trajectories, but Luca's work is much more impressive, considering that he did everything based on bare instincts. Aili thought that was why the commander noticed him, an ordinary guy, and even gave him a mechanical eye at his own expense. But Luca knew that it was all solely because he really worked hard at every training session. How could he, a feeble commoner, compare to the magnificent aristocrats? Luca always had to cling to any opportunity, being at the bottom of the hierarchy. Luca didn't know yet that Aili wasn't such an aristocrat who equated all commoners with the ground. Magnificent aristocrats, Luca, unlike them, had passed the selection fairly, but there were many nobles who had failed him. It was worth knowing. Aili was betting that they would all eventually pay for the results. Aili had no proof, but something told him that this was exactly how things were. Guys like Luca, without any support, would never fail the entire procedure of advanced soldier cultivation, because this was the only way for them to get to this place. This was a chance to break through with their own strength. Luca would never have thought that an aristocrat would tell him about the imperfections of the nobility. He never even thought about it. The main character was only interested in what exactly Aili wanted to convey to him. Reaching out his hand to him, Aili shared with him that he truly believed that only those like Luca were truly worthy of the top and no one else. Aili sincerely rooted for Luca. Luca admitted that this is what he actually wanted. All his actions are only for the good of the Empire and only for its sake. Aili understood him, but he didn't understand the desire to give his life for something that wasn't really that important. Or maybe he was the only one who thought so. This story will tell about the events from the life of a guy who was raised exclusively as a military tool. He was raised in the despotic empire of Acrisius. Planet Novus, an Earth-like planet shared by three powers, the Free Federation of Balato, the Empire of Acrisius, and the Holy Alliance of Kora. After some time, shooting practice hall. Luke was very diligent in shooting and always tried to carefully approach the choice of weapons. He was an excellent shot and could hit the target from any distance, and now Aili could see for himself. Aili was amazed that his friend was able to hit all the dummies right in the head. Aili was convinced that all the excellent students were really made of different stuff. At that moment, Aili decided to ask if Luca had gotten used to the right eye that had been successfully transported to him. Was it fair to be good at shooting when he specialized very well in close combat? Luke believed that a member of the guard should be good with any type of weapon. The main character didn't want to hear such words from his comrade, while he himself shot after shot only hit one point. Aili simply specialized in shooting. Luca knew that if Ile continued to be so carefree, he would soon be able to overtake him. But Ile would only be happy about that. After all, he seriously said that he was rooting for him. Aili was 100% sure that this empire and the whole world needed soldiers like Luke. The value of skills and talent is gradually eroding in our empire. As long as you have status and money, any weakness could become gifted. But if naturally gifted commoners like Luca suddenly start to make themselves known, people will finally begin to distinguish between the truly gifted and the untalented. Aili's words sounded like new hope and absolute truth. But he didn't take into account one thing, that his words sounded like pure criticism of the foundations of the empire. Was he really not aware of that? If Luca reports him for what he just said, they won't let him get away with it, even if Aili is Karfik. The young gentleman smiled in response to these words. Well, if he was capable of that, he wouldn't have just told about it, and Aili knew it, and he was also sure that his new comrade was a good person. In the end, Luke should have been thanked for his concern. 2 years later in the third training building, Aili and Luca were chosen to lead the squad during today's training. And if any of them had problems with this, then the commander would ask them to leave this room. Well, then it was worth continuing to act according to Aili's plan. The gorge they were heading to was illegally inhabited by Korits. This training will allow everyone to test their skills in the field. The commander of Castoria ordered not to take prisoners, but to destroy them all immediately. In fact, this was the first real mission in all this time. Luca asked Ailey if he was nervous, but most likely not, because he had already killed people during training. But this time it was the local armed forces, the Bellato Federation, the Holy Alliance of Kora, and even the Empire of Acrisius. All these people were of earthling origin. Luke warned him not to give in to emotions, unless he dared to think that the senior guards had gone with them only to protect the soldiers. A completely mechanical legion. These are the guards. They will simply kill everyone if any of the soldiers try to save the life of any of the Korites. And Luca agreed that the Empire has no place for those who do not know their place. The rest of Novus were just annoying bugs to the Empire. Lu had been taught that. Each of them wanted to cheat and use the Empire for their own gain. Ailey didn't know how to respond to that. But he knew all this even before. This was all what they were taught from childhood. They were taught to kill and to show no mercy to the Korites and anyone who in any way endangered the Empire. Having already killed most of them, Luca noticed that it seemed that all these local Korites were not even armed. This suggested that the mission would end without any incidents. At some point, Luca found himself next to a little boy. This child was very scared and called for his mother. Luca understood that this was just a little boy who was not guilty of anything. The main character saw that the child was so scared that he couldn't even move. This child was not a fighting unit that could not even resist. The child began to cry even more loudly and was already looking straight at Luca. Looking at him, the main character remembered the words of his commander about not taking prisoners and killing everyone. Luke was convinced that there was no point in hesitating. All these people were just pests who were eating up the Empire's reserves. But still, Luca's sword flew a couple of centimeters away from this child, but did not touch him. The main character suggested that the child pretend to be dead, then he would have a good chance of surviving. But doubts did not leave Luca. He thought that it was not worth doing. If the general staff found out about his actions, anything could happen to him. Luke thought about going back and finishing off the child. The next moment someone did it for him. It was a man shooting from the very top. Luca risked looking up. The shooter was Ailey. He also felt sorry for that child, but they both couldn't let him live. Ailey saw everything, and from that moment on, Luca began to worry a lot about himself. But he still hoped that Ailey would not report. Ailey realized that from now on he had to look after his comrade. The next moment, a powerful explosion occurred on the tower. At the place where Ailey stood, Luca saw it with his own eyes and began to worry about him. This sudden attack was carried out by a local shaman who possessed enormous power. Luca realized that this was the man who had caused the explosion. This man was indeed very strong, since he could easily cause an explosion without any weapon. But soon he will have to meet the rest of the members of this squad. Luca realized that this man had a power that would be difficult to defeat. The mysterious man said that this was not a military base, but a simple settlement. Soldiers killed innocent people who were simply trying to survive. Luca realized that the captain knew everything and didn't tell. If they had known this before, they wouldn't have attacked them. Ilios's body was torn apart, but he was still alive and knew that he had been careless. There was no excuse for that. In response to his words, Luca asked him to rest and leave this power wielder to him. Luca knew that this was all because he had hesitated. Luca had learned many times how to properly handle a power user. Now he had to make up for his mistake at any cost. He told the others that he would personally handle the man and that they should disperse and return to base. Realizing that his opponents were about to leave, the shaman was not going to let them go just like that. The shaman realized that this guy had taken on the role of bait so that his allies could escape. Luca himself had the same opinion about him. In order to use power, a person must perform a certain order of actions. In the case of a shaman, this is a sign with his hands. So far, Luca has managed to see these cracks in space. As long as he could see, he could withstand explosions of any power. It was clear that the shaman was trying and putting all his strength into repelling Luca's attacks. Luca himself would have preferred a battle of attrition, but there was no other choice. His body could suffer from such high-speed maneuvers. Luke was obliged to try to attack him while he had the strength and opportunity to do so. Everything worked out. Luca's speed was just right, and now he was almost close to defeating his opponent. Luca was almost sure that the shaman would not escape, but you should never underestimate your opponents. For a second, Luke thought he was about to die. Taking off his mask, the shaman saw that he was still just a child. But even his words couldn't stop Luca. The shaman died at his hands. And suddenly it dawned on the main character that if the shaman had continued his onslaught, he would have already died. The Koritavites were fanatics whose beliefs were beyond human understanding. Then Luca had only one question: why this man with higher powers couldn't kill him? Now Luca knew that during battle, you can't let your emotions consume you completely. His actions were entirely for the sake of the Empire. For the sake of the Emperor and his people, it was necessary to destroy any threat. This, and only this, was the sole purpose of the Imperial Guard's existence, nothing more. The recovery capsule ward of the Akrisha hospital. Ailey decided to ask what it was like when you felt the line between life and death. Luca thought that he should first speak for himself. He was the one who almost died there. Ailey will have new arms and legs, but Luca's back was damaged, so he ordered a set of titanium bones with artificial skin. He was going to renew his body within a couple of years anyway. A little earlier is even better. Ailey was now sure that the commander knew about the one who wielded the power. But Luca believed that he had deliberately not told them anything because he wanted to test them. If the guards had not even moved to help, then the soldiers could have handled it themselves. After all, there had been no losses in the end. Wasn't it strange? Both Luca and the other cadet who had their heads blown off by force somehow survived. It was all too strange to be a coincidence. Luca could assume that the guy had no intention of killing them at all. Luca remembered his words about him being still a very small child. But for the main character himself, this has long been not the case. He is already a warrior soldier. Sparing his life was a huge mistake on the part of this man. This worthless mercy is the reason why the Korites continue to die out in large numbers. Well, all that remains is to regret the death of his comrades from hell. Ailey suddenly became curious as to why his comrade had turned a blind eye to that Korit child. Ailey just wanted to know this. He understood Luca, but he wanted to hear the truth. Luca didn't know the answer to his question. He simply turned his back and said that Ailey's chatter was already boring. Had he really changed his language? Luca found the strength to say that it was all just an unfortunate misunderstanding. It would never happen again. So the soldiers had already completed 2 of their 4 years of training in the Imperial Guard. A new batch of young cadets had arrived, and everyone hoped that the current soldiers would serve as role models for them. Especially these two, Ailey and Luca. Their value has increased greatly in these 2 years. They were the top 1 and top 2 within the walls of this empire. And now they could even become centurions. They were obliged to work for the good of the empire and its citizens. Ailey completely agreed with everything, but Luca seemed interested in the position of centurion. The Imperial Guard was organized quite simply. It was 1,000 guardsmen divided into 10 hundreds, each led by a centurion. The commander of the guard, the chief centurion, was also the centurion of the first 100. The stories ended there. It was necessary to continue working. Cadets like Luca, after a complete replacement of the body with a mechanical one, are appointed centurions of the 10th hundred, which has the lowest rank. If the main character can become a centurion of the 10th hundred, then he can easily reach the top. But to achieve this, it was still necessary to train long and hard. And today at training, as always, Luca stood in a pair with Ailey. Luca noticed that Elias had become much stronger with his new arm. But defeating him was quite easy if you calculated everything well. During this time, the speed of the protagonist increased several times. This time, his fist stopped a couple of centimeters from Ailey's tender skin. Luca defeated him in 124 rounds out of 124. Ailey had hoped to win at least this time. If the new components could so easily ensure victory, then what was the point of training? Ailey was not stupid. He immediately noticed that he seemed to have become even more hardened after that speech. Those centurions seemed to have firmly settled in his head, and this was the pure truth. Luca believed that if he could succeed in the Imperial Guard, he would be in demand everywhere, but Ailey believed that his comrade had already achieved so much. Where his origins did not matter, why not relax then? But the truth was that, unlike Ailey, Luca had nowhere to go back to, so he continued to climb with all his might. Luca knew that Ile was very talented, but he thought that he lacked motivation. This raised the question of why he actually joined this service. Ile was glad that his comrade shared his thoughts with him. For as long as he could remember, Ile always wanted to be a scientist, an archaeologist. He dreamed of studying ancient forgotten civilizations. Then why didn't he go there, if he wanted to so much? Archaeology is forbidden in this empire, especially ancient civilizations. Besides, people from his family were often generals. Ile would not have been allowed to follow a completely different path. Did he mean to say that he was sad that he couldn't do what he liked? Luca called him spoiled. Luca knew that in his slums people dreamed of living at least one more day. Many were glad that they had something to eat today. Aili knew that Luca would say exactly that, but he was simply sharing his secret with his friend. This could be interpreted as criticism of the foundations of the empire. Aili would be finished if someone reported him. Aili was sure that Luca would do the same, just as he now kept his secret. Luca hesitated because his enemy was unarmed. Even if Ilias had not intervened, he would have carried the matter through to the end. The protagonist was loyal to the emperor and the empire for recognizing his talent. From that moment on, the empire's enemies are his own enemies. Aili was no exception for him. But he lied and Aili knew about it. And also, if his loyalty to the emperor was really beyond ordinary loyalty, then he would have already tried to kill Ilias. Aili knew he shouldn't have stressed out so much about it. Luca was surprised that all his intentions were revealed, as if it was all written on his face. Luca was sure that sooner or later, one of them would die if they continued in the same spirit. Reconnaissance, third-year mission, uninhabited neutral land. It was a mysterious place. It responded with a surge of energy even after millions of years. It was too amazing. There were civilizations that explored the stars before the dawn of humanity. Hearing this from Aili's lips, and in front of everyone, Luca became a little angry at him for continuing to trample on established boundaries. Eventually, Luca warned him that he shouldn't relax. They were on a reconnaissance mission. It was all part of the training. If they ran into anyone, there would be a fight. Well, if anything happens, the guards will definitely help them. And suddenly one of the new cadets spoke up. He knew that this thing showed that the present existed because of the past. These traces allowed one to look into the future. If you think about it this way, you can see why so many people are interested in history. Cloud Ramones is a new cadet in the Imperial Guard. Aili had known him from before. His family might not be as distinguished as Karthika, but they were still respected. Cloud wanted to ask one question specifically to Luke. Cloud liked Luca and asked if he was seeing anyone. Luca immediately pulled away from him and informed him that one more step and he would consider it a threat. But there was nothing to be afraid of. If he really had no one, then Cloud wanted to introduce him to his younger sister. But Luca was an orphan with no family. It didn't matter to Cloud whether he was an orphan or an aristocrat. Either way, Luca held an honorable position in the empire. Cloud asked him to think about it, because his sister was very pretty. A few seconds later, Ilya was next to him. He noted that his friend was very popular, but these jokes were not needed at this time. And after that, they suddenly heard something. It was a biological response. Elias's group was ordered to provide rear cover, while Luke and Cloud were to remain at the front. Something was already approaching them. From a distance, it looked like the silhouette of some person. Luke realized that they were in great trouble. The paladin of the Korits himself stood in their way. He spotted the cadets before they could come up with a plan of action. The only thing Luca managed to say was for everyone to run immediately. Paladin's weapon hit Cloud right on the spot. Cloud died before Luke's eyes. Luca hurried to check his condition, but he realized that it was already impossible to save him. Luca remembered his last words about how he would like to introduce him to his younger sister if he had no one. It seems that the protagonist saw flashes of a spear, and the upper part of Klaus's body had long since disappeared. The mechanical eye kept giving errors. For some reason it didn't want to work. Luke only wanted to calculate the trajectory of this spear, but the mechanical eye had no effect on Paladin and couldn't even scan him. Aili's squad came to help Luca. Aili reminded him that it was time to pull himself together and get himself together. Aili asked him not to stand there like a pillar, but to fight and try to gain a little time. Aili was right and Luca knew it. Even if he tried to run away, he wouldn't get out of this place. There was only one way to resolve the situation. They had to fight until Imperial Guard reinforcements arrived to help them. The countdown had already begun. Luca thought they only needed to hold out for about 20 seconds. He was sure that the guard would arrive soon. 22 seconds have already passed. 65 seconds and the enemy aimed his weapon straight at him. Luca couldn't die that easily. 1 second 72. The protagonist hoped that these 20 seconds would not be so long. 2 seconds 15. 2 seconds 25. It was becoming increasingly difficult to fight off the enemy's attack. 2 seconds 68. It seemed more and more that death was already very close. Luca finally realized that there was no way he could survive a fight with this monster for 20 seconds. And for a second, he thought he saw the commander standing in front of him. He told him that Luca looked like a cornered pig who realized he was being led to slaughter. You only had to turn your back on the enemy, and all that awaited you was a bullet in the head. While the enemy was swinging his sword, you had to do the same. The Imperial Guard is no place for weaklings. 3 seconds exactly. These words forced Luca to pull himself together and come up with a tactic. Before his enemy lunged, he had to attack first. 3 seconds 21. 4 seconds and 36. There was an explosion that made Ailey worry about his friend. 6 seconds and 11. Luca was alive. The protagonist realized with horror that he could no longer use his hand, but it could still block the spear. All that was left was to prepare for the next attack. 7 seconds 51. 8 seconds 12. Luca managed to dodge the blows several times. 9 seconds 01. But now the paladin turned his gaze to Ailey's squad. 9 seconds 51 and the entire squad was torn to pieces. Luke was shocked that the paladin's target was not actually him. 10 seconds 21. 11 seconds 53. 12 seconds 44. Finally, the supervisor came to the rescue, but Paladin had already reached Luke. But the Imperial Guard overseer was not so weak and feeble. His speed was impressive. And the next moment there was a small explosion. For a second, Luca was so impressed that he couldn't even move. In a heap of smoke, he saw the warden approaching. He survived and seemed to have won this fight. This meant that Luke was saved. But what they both didn't take into account was that the Paladin wasn't that weak either. He suffered multiple wounds but was still able to stand on his feet, and this meant that this fight would have a continuation. Well, in that case, Luca decided to remain on the sidelines for now. An Imperial Guardsman bearing the arms of the Empire, a legion. Holy Knight Kora, who uses force. Luke couldn't figure out which of them would end up being much stronger. Luca could see that they were both quite fast. Even with his eyes, he couldn't follow their weapons. This was a real Imperial Guard level fight. And the main character could only pray for the speedy victory of the Imperial Guard. Their fight acquired new colors with every second. And at that moment, Luca heard something. For a second, a thought flashed through Luca's mind. The Imperial Guard had no idea about the speed and power of the spear, which he had already felt on his own skin, which meant he would hardly be able to react correctly. It was very bad. If the guard died, then Luca would die with him. Something had to be done about this. Luke prayed that the Paladin would miss. In the end, that's what happened. The massive explosion left Luca's body 75% damaged, and he still didn't know who had won. All that was left was to hope that he wouldn't die in this place. The main character had already started to think about something bad, and that the knight Kora had survived and now everything was definitely lost. Luca asked that this not be so, and he did not even notice that right now someone was heading towards him. And when this stranger came closer, he praised this cadet for his good work. It was the Imperial Guard Overseer, and he was able to defeat that knight only because of him. The Overseer noticed that Luca had been wounded in the stomach. He had been wounded back then, when he tried to dodge that force cut. The Imperial Guard said that he would help them up, and they would return to the base together. The Legion is a fully mechanical suit of armor issued by the Empire to the Imperial Guard. It could replace all the vulnerable parts of the body that were useless in combat. This allowed a person to become a full-fledged weapon. Every cadet dreamed of getting a Legion, because it is evidence that you are a full-fledged guard of the Empire. However, this guard was still alive and without a brain. Then the only thing left to assume was that he was no longer a man, but just a machine. Until Luca said this, the guard himself did not realize that his brain was gone. Was Luca really that keen to become such a monster all this time? With each passing second, Luca felt colder. Will he be able to wait for help? What was around him seemed like it was the last sight he would ever see. And suddenly, in this darkness, Ailey appeared. Ailey survived, not in the best shape of course, but still. Luca asked how the rest of the squad was doing, but it turned out that everyone except for the two of them had already died. Ailey asked how serious his wounds were. It seemed to Luca that he was already dying. Luke asked him what he was going to do next. Luca told him that everything he wanted was right under his nose. In this direction was the alliance of Kora and Balato. What he so desired was simply impossible to obtain in the Empire. It was the perfect chance to escape, and everyone would think they were both dead. Luca tried to convince him that he was okay, and that Ilya needed to go. Reinforcements were about to arrive. If they crossed paths, all that was left was to return to the Empire. So Luca asked him to leave, and Ailey really did start to get back on his feet. And Luke just watched him. Ailey has a family noble and rich enough to support him at all times. Any citizen of the Empire would be envious. So Luke won't be able to understand him. But there was something that was beautiful about this Ailey. Ailey shone much brighter when he talked about his dreams, and so Luca wished with all her heart for him to live the way he wanted. But no, Ailey won't leave him that easily. Feeling his touch, Luke opened his eyes and asked what he was doing. Ailey noticed that judging by his behavior, Luca was indeed getting ready to go to the next world. Ailey said that he would not be able to live peacefully if he left his friend to die like this. Luca didn't understand him and called him a dunce. Meanwhile, help had already arrived. Some time has passed. Catalogue of cybernetic products. Luca has already undergone the necessary rehabilitation and has been given new mechanical body parts. And then suddenly Eiley's voice was heard behind him. He noticed that he was looking for spare parts. Eiley could recommend him a very good model. With its short adaptation period, Luca would be able to return to action faster, and it was much better than the one he was currently using. Luca got tired of Eiley always appearing out of nowhere. Eiley apologized for scaring him. After returning to the Empire and undergoing rehabilitation, Eiley was summoned to another department for questioning. They wanted to know what had happened that 3 cadets and an Imperial Guard overseer had died. This incident was called the encounter with Paladin Kora. At first, Eiley thought that he was called because they were going to investigate this case in depth, but the reason was different. By the way, Luca should have heard by now that some artifact was found in the place where they were sent. And now everyone was arguing about who should get it. Luca thought so. That cube floating in the air was the reason for everything. The protagonist wondered who had finally gotten their hands on him, but it turned out that they had reassigned a team specially equipped for research purposes. If the Holy Alliance refuses to give up this place and the artifact, a great massacre will come. If the Empire declares war on the Alliance, then Balata will benefit just by watching us fight. Therefore, they usually try to limit themselves to small clashes, so that the numerical losses do not hurt anyone. But Luca was not very interested in political issues. Only direct orders and battles had any weight for him. He still believed that this was what every member of the Imperial Guard should be like. Imperial Guard. When Luca reported that the decapitated guard member continued to move right before his eyes, the captain was able to conclude that it was a phantom phenomenon caused by residual signals. But the protagonist doubted that it could really be a residual signal as he was told. Luca remembered that this guard consciously responded to all his words after death. This was definitely not a phantom phenomenon. There were so many questions in Luke's mind that had no answers. But Luca is not so stupid as to try to figure all this out. He should not have to figure out something that the higher-ups refused to answer. In the vastness of the training grounds, there is one place that did not quite fit the atmosphere of the guard. This place was a guest room. It was created exclusively for family and friendly meetings with cadets. Being an orphan, Luca had never been to this place before today. So he didn't even expect that someone would want to meet him. Lillian Ramones is the sister of the deceased cadet Klaus Ramones. Luca did not understand why she personally decided to come to him. The protagonist didn't want her to start asking about her brother's death just because Luca was the leader of this squad. It was as if the girl had read his mind. And if he thought she had come to express her hatred towards him, there was no need to worry about it. Lillian said that from the very day her brother decided to become a member of the Imperial Guard, her family had been prepared for such news. And now the girl came to Luca himself on a personal matter. She said that her brother talked about him a lot, that he was the most talented friend among the other cadets for her brother. He even asked if she wanted to date him. Lillian thought that Luca himself knew about her origin. It was her initiative. Now she just had to settle a few formalities. Luke could see that she looked like she was interested in a relationship with him too. Was he really against it? Luca answered that he didn't know her at all, but the girl believed that all this could still be fixed. Luca still didn't understand why she chose him. The fact that it was his brother's dying request was a good enough reason. Besides, Lillian was sure that Luca would only benefit from this union. Many guys dreamed of being in his place. Luca agreed with her. There was absolutely no reason to refuse her. For someone like him to get such a golden bride of noble blood, it was a 1 in a million chance. The main character has always strived for success in this life. A wedding with an aristocrat will only bring him closer to this goal. What else could one wish for? However, it was all somehow too simple. In fact, he was tormented by very serious doubts. Without another second's thought, he refused it. Lillian was stunned. Getting up from the table, he said goodbye to her in the hope that they would not meet again. And he still thought Ilias, who had everything, was an idiot for dreaming of getting out of the Empire. Who would have known that Luca himself would be so stupid as to make this decision based on his doubts? Luca was almost certain that Lillian would take this as an insult to the aristocrats. He could only hope that it would not turn into something serious. Unexpectedly, the girl grabbed his hand. She realized that perhaps she had rushed things too quickly. In the end, she decided to suggest starting everything with friendship. But that wasn't the point at all. The girl did not wait for him to continue. She left promising that they would see each other again and that she would visit him again soon. Luke thought about everything he had heard and what he could refuse. Apparently it won't be easy to get rid of her. Akritia, a training ground for sparring. Kinuan is a fighting instructor in the Imperial Guard. The instructor did not think that Luca would ever come to him. The main character came to him because he wanted to learn from him. He could easily help in everything related to fighting. However, Luca was already very strong and already knew a lot. No matter how many cadets you go through, you will hardly find a couple of those who will be stronger than him in anything. So there were those who were stronger than him. It wasn't enough for Luca that he was considered the best cadet in the course. The instructor did not understand why this particular cadet was straining himself so much. Fighting instructor Kinuan, although he is strong, he is not as despot as other instructors. Unlike other instructors and guards, he uses a rather mediocre enhancement in combat. It is 10 times weaker compared to what Luca himself was currently wearing. The only thing Luca was losing in was that his entire body was not stitched, so he was simply weaker. But if he couldn't win even against the instructor, then he didn't even have a chance to win against Paladin Kora, and there won't be a chance for anyone like him. Luca thanked the instructor for the opportunity to train. And the instructor didn't really have much of a choice. It was his job, and he was simply obliged to teach something. And a moment later, he asked the guy to attack. The instructor assumed that the cadet simply wanted to try out the new equipment. He may be a retired guard, but Luca was almost certain that the instructor wouldn't even flinch from such an attack. Luca was just going to jump on him to close the gap between them. He was going to finish this all off with one quick strike. It seemed that victory was already clearly his, but it was not so. The instructor had one special method. It still wouldn't stop Luca, even though he didn't understand what had happened to him. It really was some kind of devilry. Instructor Kinuan noticed that not only had Luca misjudged his opponent, but he had also allowed himself to be distracted by something during the fight. Kinuan could not understand what caused his student to behave so impatiently. Now the main character could not understand at all what had happened to him. Luca thought that with his first attack he would be able to hit Instructor Kinuan in the chin. However, he not only managed to dodge, but also touched his opponent's hand. As soon as he did so, his body itself disobeyed, as if he had lost control of himself. No, to be precise, the kinetic energy he had given to Kinuan was redirected back, shaking only Luca himself. Standing up, Luca decided to find out more about what had just happened. It turned out that it was a personal method of self-defense. Luke asked the instructor to try teaching him this method. Instructor Kinuan was amazed that his student wanted to learn such a complex action. But this method also had its consequences. Such a shortcut always comes at a price. So the instructor decided to first ask Luca what he had learned from this fight. The main character felt as if he had been bewitched. His body began to move on its own and did not obey its master at all. This method was called Archis Victima or Archis fighting style. Luca knew that it was usually something that bandits used. What he saw was so impressive that he would even implement it into the military training program. In fact, the instructors looked at her, but there were 3 major flaws in Archis Victima. It was very difficult for her to learn. The inspector was surprised that Luca answered correctly. He really was very smart. And then Luca ventured to suggest that when using it, side effects in the form of a concussion were possible. It was all true enough, and there was something else that Luca would hardly be able to understand right now. But Luca believed that if this made him much stronger, then all the risks would automatically be justified. But he couldn't decide that. Luca was already an asset of the Empire. He had to understand how much money was invested in each cadet. The instructor wanted his student to answer him something. Kinuan explained that training in the Archais fighting style would inevitably leave after effects in his brain, and that Luca would have to swear to stop using it when that happened. There was no point in lying, the instructor would have figured it out anyway. And then, Luca answered honestly that he could not swear, but promised that he would try not to use it. Instructor Kinuan really liked the honesty that came out of him. And finally, the instructor threw him over himself so that he would not lose his vigilance. From now on, Luke will always have to wait for him to attack. He must be prepared for any situation. The instructor asked him to stand up because he liked those who learned quickly. Ailey periodically noticed that Luca seemed to fall asleep and did not hear anything at all. He often thought about everything. 1 month later, Luca has been practicing with Instructor Kinuan for a month now. Kinuan saw that if Luca didn't understand it with just one look, nothing would change if he tried to explain it to him in words. In fact, Instructor Kinuan hadn't taught him anything. He wanted Luca to watch and figure it out for himself. During all this time, the protagonist realized that Arki's fighting style was very different from everything he had learned before. Most fighting techniques are based on learning movements and honing them, while Arki's squeezes out of you what you already have. It was some kind of higher combat algorithm that used absolutely all the techniques of the already existing personal arsenal in order to give out the most effective method of confrontation in a specific situation in a matter of seconds. Simply put, it was a very strong and intense brain training. Luca decided to ask Ailey himself how the mission had gone. Ailey replied that it had been a bore. He had only been told to get rid of the faulty android. Ailey thought that all the current missions were like child's play. Apparently, the Kora Alliance was being too cautious because of the last incident. That was probably why the chief centurion was on the site all the time. But no, that's not why. Ailey had already heard something from his relatives. If the chief centurion himself was getting involved, then a rebellion had definitely already been planned, no less. Ailey didn't know the details, but there was definitely a group of conspirators. Luke was angry that the war with the Alliance was about to start, and someone was finding time to plan a civil war. Ailey believed that if his comrade attributed all internal problems to idiocy, then he, too, was part of the problem. He will pay dearly for these words. After all, Luca had warned him from the very beginning. The protagonist could turn a blind eye to the fact that his friend wanted to leave the Empire, but if he was planning to become an enemy, Luca would not be able to let it go. Actually, Ailey also passed the Imperial Guard aptitude test. Such remarks are no less important for the Empire. Understanding this, Luca should have finally calmed down. There was no need to make any more conclusions that could be misunderstood. Luca really didn't want to see Ilias's name on the list of traitors, but Ilias knew that he could just share all of this with his friend. Ailey asked him to relax because he wanted to treat him to something tasty on the weekend, but Luca already had plans for that moment. As he was leaving, he asked not to chat anymore because he was already annoying. Ailey was curious about what kind of plans he might have and whether he really got himself a girlfriend. Luca didn't answer this question. On the weekend, the lower sector of Acretia. Luca was surprised that so much time had passed and the lower sector still hadn't changed. For people like them from the slums, the picture was quite familiar. When Luca managed to become a cadet, he thought that he would never have to end up in the lower sector again, and now he did not want to breathe the same air as the local people here. Kinuan realized that this guy was truly one of those who would strive upward with all his might. Still, the main character couldn't even imagine that Instructor Kinuan would drag him to this place when he announced his plans. The air in the lower sector was very polluted. The city is fed by thermal energy from the magma located directly below it, and all the waste and excess heat goes to the lower sector. In the past, Luca breathed this terrible air for quite a long time. He felt he had to get out, or he could remain a loser for the rest of his life. And now, walking down the street, the protagonist clearly smelled shit. Soon Kinuan turned off the road. And then Luca realized that they had come to the black market. Luca was actually new to this place. The curious kids rarely left this place. Instructor Kinuan was quite knowledgeable when it came to the lower sector. Someone who had been an Imperial Guard for decades knew the place better than Luke himself. For a second, it seemed very funny. Before coming to this place, Instructor Kinuan asked Luca to use simpler prosthetic arms and legs on this trip. And from that moment on, it became very interesting to find out about the instructor's true intentions. A second later, the instructor asked him to get ready. They approached the main entrance, which forced the security guard to stop them and inform them that the entrance for spectators was on the other side. But Kinuan replied that he would like to speak with the owner of this establishment. The guards assumed that this man might know their boss Aleph, but this was not the case. Kinuan just wanted to see him. And then the guards pointed their guns at them, realizing that they could be enemies. The instructor was not going to wait for them to be finished off and attacked first. Meanwhile, Luca attacked the second guard and ordered the others at gunpoint not to move. It seemed that now everything was sorted out, and it was possible to quickly call Aleph. When the guards left, Luca decided to ask what the instructor would have done if he hadn't made it in time. Well, Kinuan would probably have looked for another way to avoid dying, that's obvious. Looking around, the main character still did not understand what kind of place this was. It was the hottest spot in the entire empire. It was the Colosseum. A couple of minutes later, Luca and the instructor were inside and sitting in Aleph's office. It turned out that Inspector Kinuan had come to this place to ask for Luca to be released into the arena. He also said that no fee was needed. If the boy died, there would be no claims against Aleph. Now it was clear why the instructor had made him wear weak prosthetics. Aleph didn't listen to the whole sentence and threw the butt of his cigar at Kinuan. There was no doubt that Luca would be able to catch it before it fell on the instructor's clothes. After that, Aleph's men pointed their pistols. Aleph thought that these people must have mixed something up. After all, he hadn't let them in to fulfill their requests. This place was more convenient for getting rid of the corpses. But Luca, on the contrary, thought that these bandits were bluffing. If Aleph had not wanted to talk, he would have started shooting long ago. 3 of his men were aiming at Luca. Luca remembered that there were 2 more with guns behind the door. The first thing we needed to do was come up with a plan to deal with everyone as quickly as possible. The simulation was over. The main character was brought out of his imagination by Kinuan's voice, who had just decided to inquire about where the previous manager had gone. Aleph was surprised that this man knew Kora. It turned out that he had died a couple of days ago when he was caught rigging the results. It seemed that Aleph had removed him and successfully taken his place. After all, the arena is a goose that lays golden eggs. Kinuan said that he and Kora were very good friends, but even so, he held no grudge against his killer. Kora had also killed the previous manager so that he could get into this place. This was not at all surprising. In the slums, such things were normal. These words made Aleph raise his gun again and point it at the instructor's head. He still didn't know who this man was or what he really knew. But Aleph had to calm down if he didn't want to follow Kora. And after these words, he really decided to return to his former place. For a few minutes, Aleph thought over Kinuan's proposal and asked again about this boy. Did he really want to get into the arena? Aleph scanned him and discovered that Luca didn't even have combat prosthetics. This meant that in the arena, he would become the most common meat that would be rolled out in an instant. Aleph could release him, but certainly not for a simple thank you. Instructor Kinuan had a special offer for this case. He knew where Kora had hidden his safe, and he believed that Kora's eye was currently with Aleph. Aleph had no idea how this respected man could know so much, and now he became wildly interested in finding out who he was. Kinuan was just a relic of the past that was better left untouched and unattended. Aleph suggested he watch this fight in a VIP venue where he would be provided with the best drinks and girls. But the instructor would only need something strong, and he shouldn't judge this boy by his appearance alone. He needed to find a very serious opponent. Luca realized that Kinuan actually had a lot to learn. He controlled the situation, overwhelming the enemy with his mere presence. He has qualities that Luca himself lacked. Arena locker room. The fight was supposed to be in 2 hours, so the instructor suggested that the guy warm up. Luca became curious about what was really in that safe, that Aleph changed his anger to mercy so quickly. It turned out that there could be riches stored there that could easily change his life. The main character asked him what he would do if he had to fight. Instructor Kinuan saw that the guy was very interested in finding out, but first let him win this fight and then he would tell him everything. Gabriel Iron Fist will be his opponent in this fight. The arena was full of idiots willing to ruin their health for illegal modifications. This Gabriel was one of them, ready to do anything for the sake of strength. Luca thought that he had changed himself very much. With such prosthetics, Luca could die from one blow. The main character had to remember one thing that the instructor would tell him. It was the basis of the Aiki's fighting style. I had to spend most of my time adapting to what I had. But Luca had been taught that to adapt meant to lose. But Kinuan believed that water did not lose, but merely changed its form. The instructor believed that Luca had potential. He noticed it back when Luca blocked bullets without a ballistic calculator. The instructor was extremely surprised when the boy asked him to become a teacher. A man with such talent came to him himself, as if led by fate. Something about the instructor made him feel like complimenting me, but this is only because Luca might not come out of this fight alive. 2 hours later, arena. The megaphone has already announced that the new adjutant has risked challenging the arena's terror, Gabriel Iron Fist, to a fight. Will this boy ever return home? In the arena, he was given the nickname Good Boy. Luca couldn't understand how anyone could come up with such a stupid nickname. Many people around him were against him. They believed that this boy was simply looking for a quick death and that today they would be in for a real bloodbath. Many were in anticipation. The dark desire to see someone else's pain and blood has pushed many to find themselves in this place today. Luca knew that many were already waiting for the moment when he would be torn to shreds. He liked this thought very much. The moment he entered the arena felt like Luca had come home. Today he will show them a real fight, and how did all these losers live all this time without him? As a child, Luca was constantly hungry, wore tattered clothes and unusable sneakers. The bureaucrats from Mangretia brought rations to the shelter once a month, but half of them always disappeared somewhere. The director sold them in the slums. Hunger was a constant companion and part of the inmates of any shelter. But even when he was starving, Luca always tried to train hard. He greedily read dusty books that no one cared about and lifted rusty iron to pump up his muscles. One day, something came into his head. These were the other kids from his shelter, and they thought that Luca was a real idiot, since he was just wasting his energy on all sorts of nonsense like that. At this rate, he would remain even hungrier. Luca didn't even think about listening to them. Instead, he was coming up with his own plan of action to never go hungry again. And from that moment on, he began to train himself so that when he got hungry, he could easily just take food from someone else. Luca already knew then that only the strongest can survive. Over time, the protagonist began to understand this world very well. The strong feasted, the weak starved, so it was, is, and will be. When the boys learned of his strength, they began to think that he was just showing off. He was from the same 2-digit shelter as the rest of them. If he were better than them, he would have ended up in a 1-digit shelter. Many people considered themselves and everyone else in this shelter to be nothing more than slum rats. Even then, Luca didn't listen to the grumbling of losers. At the age of 12, the main character passed the second selection for the guard, and at 15, he was able to become a cadet. And everyone else in the shelter doesn't have the brains to understand what people can do. Since the day he was taken away, Luca lived in the barracks and had long forgotten about the slums. He thought he would never return to this place again. As soon as Gabriel entered the battlefield, everyone forgot to think about this boy. Gabriel himself was surprised that Aleph decided to give him such a small fry as a rival. However, Gabriel didn't care. He knew that money doesn't stink. Taking a closer look at his opponent, Luca noticed that his prosthetic arms and legs were from different manufacturers, and the symmetry of his body was completely disrupted. Because of the heavy parts, the spine was curved, and there were constant inflammations where the prostheses were connected to the body. Without painkillers, Gabriel probably can't even sleep. But even despite this, he was strong, because he remade his body just for the sake of this strength. Looking closely at the boy, Gabriel noticed that he was very handsome. In that case, he could become his servant. By the way, that was a very good idea. Gabriel definitely won't be able to do without a servant. Because today he will become a cripple. These words made him very angry. But still, Gabriel asked that he not be maimed so much that he would not have to ask someone to wipe his ass. Well, this world is a cruel place where violence and death rule, and now many people need to see it in miniature. People were betting on who would trample whom, who would be able to defeat whom. The bloodbath was beginning. The only significant difference between them is that Gabriel had cheap but combat prosthetics, while Luca had ordinary ones. In other words, one attack from this thug and Luca will be finished. Gabriel risked attacking first, but received in response a tickling that he did not understand. But if Luca had combat prosthetics, his opponent would have already been blown to pieces. Turning slightly, Luca noticed that the arena was too small for him, and now he realized that he wouldn't be able to dodge forever. Any blow from the iron fist could easily kill him, but Luca's blows were like pellets to an elephant. And the audience was also against Luca. Everyone was rooting for Gabriel and already dreaming that Luca would die because they wanted to see the next fight. In other words, it's a situation you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Thoughts about what Kinuan was really trying to achieve by bringing him here did not give Luca any peace. He kept remembering his instructor's words about this being the basis of Akis's fighting style. He had to adapt to everything he had at the moment. Luca knew that his wishes couldn't solve the problem, and weapons didn't fall from the sky, so he had to use what he had, even if it seemed like it would be catastrophically insufficient. Instructor Kinuan took away his legs and arms, but for some reason left him with a mechanical eye. So he just didn't want Luca to rely on brute force alone. Adaptation is what would help him win. To use what you have with maximum efficiency, that is what Akis really meant. Gabriel's fist is heavy artillery, the tremor of his shoulder is the trigger, his gaze is the barrel, the length of his arms is the range of the shot. But unlike a real weapon, it had a fairly long swing, a short range, and the trajectory of the blow was too predictable. Instructor Kinuan was very pleased. Luca was a real genius in his eyes. Luke himself, without realizing it, had already mastered the basics of Akis, and now all that was left for him to do was to reveal his talent. First, it was necessary to choose the right place to deliver a powerful blow. The public was already angry with Gabriel himself. No one understood why he had taken so long to deal with him. The main character was focused as never before. Sometimes he couldn't even predict his opponent's blows. Luca suddenly remembered the move that Instructor Kinuan had demonstrated on him. I wonder if he could repeat it. After the main character dealt Gabriel a couple of blows, he himself began to get excited. Could this really be what Kinuan was waiting for? Gabriel himself was already fed up with all this. He no longer understood what kind of tricks this kid was planning to do. Well, he already said that this guy's blows were just a tickle for him. Did he really think that it would be impossible to defeat him and that he would remain without even a single scratch? If the prostheses lacked power, it could easily be compensated for by something else. And he succeeded. Luca was able to knock his opponent off his feet. And now let everyone else wish him down as much as they want. Luke will rise so high that he won't even hear their pitiful whisper. The protagonist knew that on a real battlefield, where everything was unpredictable, he would not be able to do this. Luca achieved such concentration only because everything was under control. And now he's going to have to admit something. Instructor Kinuan is an excellent teacher. At the exit of the arena, he already met the winner and gave him all the praise. Kinuan congratulated the boy on his first step towards Akia's victima. And Luca realized that, in fact, adaptation is not always a loss. After these words, the instructor handed him something. At first, Luca thought it was a credit chip, his fee for winning the fight, but it turned out not to be. It was Gabriel's medical supplies that needed to be taken and handed directly into his hands. Kinuan believed that sometimes it was good to show kindness, so as not to look pathetic. On the other hand, Luca wanted to be a warrior, not a saint. Due to his age, Luca did not understand this yet. Kinuan's kindness is not charity, but an investment in a good future. You need to make useful people, so that later you can turn to them for help. And today he was simply able to return what he once invested in the Torah. Creating favorable conditions for yourself is an important quality for a good soldier. It is something worth remembering for the rest of your life. And from that moment on, Luca realized that he had been seriously mistaken about Kinuan. He thought that the instructor was teaching him because of his talent, and because they both came from the lowest of the low. But that was far from true. Instructor Kinuan would definitely want to get his investment back someday, and he would do it in such a way that Luca would simply be forced to agree. Meanwhile, the medical facility. Due to the narrow signal band, the device was incompatible with Gabriel's prostheses. The high power of these prostheses can cause a numbness failure. The doctor would advise him to install a hyperlindal number 9 from the company Geonic. But it was the latest model, which Gabriel simply physically did not have enough money for. Did the doctor really want to rob him? Gabriel still believed that people could live a normal life with cheap prosthetics, but he forgot about his lifestyle and did not modify themselves like he did. If Gabriel had taken care of compatibility, the old prosthetics would have worked fine. But then he simply had no money and so had to install whatever was available. In that case, Luca could buy his current prostheses and install joint ones for him based on the amount he had. At least the basic ones would be enough for Gabriel, but nothing would work out on Gabriel's money. He would only have enough for used household prostheses. The doctor must have simply not known how much all this stuff cost. Luca had been standing at the door for a good 5 minutes. He said that he just decided to come in and check on him. He was glad to see that his rival was feeling cheerful. The Iron Fist almost fell over in that hospital bed out of surprise. Gabriel was still angry with him, and now promised that he would not leave a single wet spot on him. After all, Luke warned him before the fight that he would end up crippled. And after these words, the protagonist suddenly remembered the words of Instructor Kinuan. It was not necessary to forget that creating favorable conditions for oneself is also an important quality of a good soldier. Based on this alone, Luca realized that he should not have provoked him now. After finishing chatting with him, Luca asked the doctor again about the prosthetics. Luca did not wait for an answer, but immediately showed the required amount and asked if it was enough for him. The doctor confirmed that the money was indeed enough for him. Gabriel didn't understand at all why this boy would pay for such an expensive prosthetic, but Luca stood firm and tried to pay for his treatment as soon as possible. Gabriel asked him again for what purpose he was doing all this, and the protagonist answered that he just wanted to. From this, the Iron Fist concluded that this boy's nickname for the arena was not just a nickname, it was true in life. Was this really the mercy of the winner? And then Gabriel decided to ask what his real name was. Gabriel said that if Luke needed help, he could contact him at any time from now on. Gabriel remained in his debt. Luca was surprised that everything turned out to be so simple, and it was even very pleasant. The training hall of the Imperial Guard cadets of Acrisius. Luca and Ailey were paired with each other again. But during all this time, Luca became much stronger, and his reaction improved significantly. With one movement of his hand, he was able to lift and turn Ailey in the air. The fall was very painful. After finishing the training in the locker room, Ailey asked his friend if he really had trained with instructor Kinyuan and taught him the Eiki style. This was true, and Luca had no intention of hiding it. Ailey thought that Aki's was just a street fighting style used by all the low-life thugs. They hide shards of glass in their fists or throw sand in their eyes. Luca was actually confused by this too, but since he calls it that, he'll have to believe it. Now Ile shouldn't even dream of defeating him in hand-to-hand combat. But Ile was the only cadet who could give Luca a run for his money. The experience in the arena turned his understanding of combat upside down. All his skills seemed to condense into pure energy. Ailey noticed that Luca was in a very good mood today, and then Ailey decided to ask him for a free minute, and Luca really did have one. The visiting room of the Accretion Guard Training Center. Sitting on a chair, Luca did nothing but stare at Ailey. Ailey apologized to him for this. It turned out that he had known the Ramoneses for a long time, and now he simply could not refuse Lillian. Lillian herself constantly asked for a meeting, but for some reason they both avoided her. And it wasn't like that. Luca just wasn't interested in her, and meetings with her didn't make any sense. So Luca hoped that she would understand his refusal because he didn't show up for dates. After his words, Ailey asked him to be more gentle about everything, but was asked to shut his mouth. Luca was already irritated by this whole situation. Lillian was very curious about what he didn't like about her, and Luca simply replied that he didn't have time for a relationship. Unlike the two of them, he was an orphan, and if he stumbled even once, he would never be given a chance to get back up again. In that case, Lillian thought that he should be friends with her even more, and Luca replied that she simply did not understand him. Relying on her aristocratic power meant that one whim of hers could destroy everything, and Luca wanted to achieve everything himself. All this time Ailey dreamed of falling into the ground, but isn't it a contradiction to be friends with Ailey and at the same time say that he does not want to rely on the aristocracy? Luca replied that he communicates with Ailey not because he is from the influential Karfik family, but because he is his friend and comrade, to whom he himself could personally trust even his life. Lillian was surprised that Luke didn't even want to try to give her a chance. In fact, Luke didn't even think about it seriously. Unfortunately, he really didn't want to give her a chance, and so he asked her not to bother him anymore. Luke was very angry at both of them, but it seems like Ailey was trying to tell him something. Having caught up with Luca, he asked why Luca had been answering her so rudely all the time. Otherwise, she would hardly have left him alone. Ailey completely agreed with him, but he didn't understand why he was so harsh. He could have tried dating her. Luca simply couldn't understand why Lillian Ramones was clinging to him, simply because her late brother had advised her to. She didn't know him at all, and Luca had absolutely nothing to offer her. She must have some hidden motives. That is, he was scared because he didn't know her, but now he could at least try to get to know her better. And at that moment, Luca cut off all his words. He asked if Lillian liked Ailey himself. Ailey was wondering why he had made all this up, but Luca understood it from his breathing, from his look and confusion. Everything was clear. After Luca began studying Aki's victim, he began to notice things that he could not understand and see before. In general, he didn't care about it. If Ailey really was pining for her, then he needed to stop mumbling and start acting. The truth was, it just wasn't for him. It was a training, a meditation. It was necessary so that Luca could remain calm at any moment. Luca thought it was a good time to ask Kinyuan what he would have done in Alef's office if a fight had broken out. He had promised to tell him if he won. There were armed bandits in the office and outside then. Luca couldn't figure out how to get out of there without weapons and injuries. Luca was very curious about what Kinyuan would do then, but it turned out that he would just hide under the table. The protagonist didn't really appreciate this joke. After all, Alef and his bandits had pistols. Wouldn't Kinyuan have turned into a sieve if he had given them a chance to attack first? Instructor Kinyuan knew that Luca would have rushed at the bandits even under bullets, and that would have opened a window for him to maneuver. But what if Luca had not been there, or he would have also run away or hidden without attacking? But Kinyuan knew that when Luca went there, he was going to take Alef hostage and take their guns. Luca was trained to be aggressive, so he would have attacked right away. But then Aleph and Luca would have been killed right away. Bosses don't live long in the slums. The protagonist's actions would have given Aleph's people a reason to kill him. Of course, as soon as Luca was taken at gunpoint, Kinuan would have dealt with the bandits and pulled him out through the secret passage. Luca was very surprised that Kinuan not only foresaw his actions, but also knew about the secret passage. These are some kind of superhuman abilities. Akis in the ancient language means sharp eye. Aki's victima uses all the resources of the brain, developing insight. This also had to be remembered. So Kinuan's brain problems are just the consequences of using Akis to the limit of its capabilities. And then it dawned on Luca that if he put on the Legion, he would not be able to use Aki's victim. Kinuan was completely convinced that this boy was actually very gifted. But in fact, Instructor Kinuan had thought from the very beginning that it would take him several months to understand this. As a guardsman, Luca can get a Legion, but no one can wear this armored prosthesis, stuffed with the advanced technologies of the Empire, all the time. It consumes so much brain power that you even have to connect an additional processor. That is, it was simply incompatible with the Legion of Aki's victim. Luca was very angry that Kinuan knew about this, and said nothing. If he had known that he could not be used with the Legion, he would not have wasted his time training. This was Luca's own stupidity. That meant that training would be over. Luca thanked Instructor Kinuan for everything he had done for him. If Luca changes his mind, he can come again at any time. Luke was actually sorry that things had turned out this way. He would have liked to continue this training, but the Legion was his dream. The office of the chief centurion. 3 months have already passed. Gemellus Castoria was so busy that he did not devote any time to his cadets. As Ailey said, he was probably called only because of the mutiny, but the chief centurion asked about how Luca's affairs were actually going to be. Luca said that he was training independently and had not been given any tasks for a long time. It turned out that the main character would no longer perform field missions. He was already ready to become one of the centurions. Luca thanked his commander for such an honor. By the way, the commander said that he had heard that Luca was now meeting with Instructor Kinuan quite often. Hearing this, Luca became a little wary, because he knew that he had been called precisely because of this. The command probably already knew absolutely everything, about his visit to the black market, and about his participation in the battle in that arena. Gemellus asked him if his instructor Kinuan had taught him the art of Aki's victima, and he had, except that Luca was quick to say that he had no more training in it. The commander believed that it was not Kinuan who had abandoned Luca, but Luca himself who had left. It was surprising that the commander had predicted everything so accurately. The commander simply assumed that Luca had abandoned these studies because the Aki's victimus could not be used with the Legion, and he would need it very soon. The commander wondered if Luca had realized this yet. It turns out that Kinuan himself drives away the weaklings, and those who are capable of much quickly realize that they do not need this technique. That is why no one except Kinuan owns it. Did the commander really want Luca to continue studying Aki's victim? To be precise, the commander wanted Luca to maintain a close relationship with Instructor Kinuan, and to do that, he needed to continue training. That was an order. Luca was shocked that the commander was afraid of Kinuan, but why was he watching this old soldier? But asking questions was strictly forbidden. If Luca could find out the truth, his life could be in danger. The protagonist agreed to continue training, but he should have known that the commander now intended to watch him too. The commander knew that Luca was one of those cadets who was capable of going far. Meeting place with Kinuan, the instructor did not expect to see him so soon. Well, he himself had told Luca to come back any time, so Kinuan wasn't going to ask anything more. Luca thanked him for the opportunity to continue his training again. Although in fact Luca thought that Kinuan would not take him back, but he agreed unexpectedly easily. The protagonist wondered why the instructor was in the lower district today, and Kinuan asked him if even modern children dreamed of these toys. As it turned out, as a child, Luca spent hours staring at toys that he could never afford. Hearing this, Kinuan called the seller, but he told him to look for it himself if he really needed something because he didn't know anything. But Kinuan wasn't going to look for anything. He asked to give him all the toys that were in this store, and he asked about delivery. Luca was very surprised and could not understand why he needed all these toys. 35 minutes later, they appeared at the doors of shelter number 47 in the lower district. Luca did not understand why they had come here. Kinuan asked to take the boxes to the yard, and after that, Luca could rest in peace. But Luca had already called his friend for help. Gabriel was angry that the boy had pulled him out just for this. Hadn't Gabriel said that Luca could ask him for help at any time? And now he just needed to take all these things to the place where, unfortunately, almost nothing was delivered. Gabriel was still counting on something more serious. For example, help in the showdown, but Luca doubted that Gabriel could help him much in this matter. Gabriel agreed with him on this. Taking advantage of the moment, Luca decided to examine him more closely. He noticed that the money had not gone down the drain. With the new spine, Gabriel's balance had improved greatly. But Gabriel wanted to know what kind of person was with them. If he's so important that Aleph wets his pants in front of him, then Gabriel should know everything about him. But if his life is dear to him, then it's better not to try to find out. Apparently, Luca dared to think that Kinuan grew up in this orphanage. Could he really be doing charity work after achieving unimaginable success? The children were very happy with the new gifts and thanked them all for it. Luca noticed two boys fighting over a box of toys. He thought that it was right, let them learn to take everything by force, because there is not enough for everyone. Luca, like no one else, knew that if you want to get something, be strong under any circumstances. There aren't enough resources for everyone in this world. As he was thinking about this, Kinuan approached him. It turned out that Kinuan really wanted to talk to him about one topic. Kinuan told him that he dropped by the slums from time to time. The salary at the shelter was a pittance, but the director, judging by his appearance, made a good living on the rations. Luca decided to ask him if the instructor had grown up here. Kinuan didn't even remember. He just sometimes decided to drop by the nearest shelters and help. Maybe he was even at Luca's shelter. Looking at Kinuan, Luca understood that he was just an ordinary old soldier. A veteran with failing health and a clouded mind. An old warrior who had lost his former glory. Luca thought about how the same fate could await him in the end, or at the end of his journey. If, of course, he can live to be that old. After his story, Kinuan decided to get down to business. Kinuan became curious to know the real reason why Luca decided to return to him. He guessed that it was the chief commander who ordered him. At first, Luca did not answer his question. He pretended to be shocked by this question. And then he asked what Kinuan meant, but looking him in the eyes was risky. For the eyes of Instructor Kinuan, every false rustle is a clue. How could he even know that this was an order from the chief centurion? Luca wondered how many things Kinuan had already uncovered. If the instructor was really hiding something dangerous, something so important that the chief centurion would assign a spy like Luca to him. In that case, Kinuan can eliminate him here and now. Kinuan seemed to read all his thoughts. He asked the boy to calm down if he wanted to live. If Luca attacks him with full force, Kinuan will have a hard time resisting him without killing him. Luke was a soldier of the Empire, and that was all he could tell him. Kinuan knew that Luca still knew so little that he didn't even understand who he should join. The instructor did not blame him. It was natural for a soldier to follow orders from above. Luke was indeed the ideal soldier the Empire needed. Kinuan asked him about the fact that when Luke came to him, he really thought that he did it of his own free will. Kinuan told him that the higher-ups had already stirred when Luca demonstrated an accurate trajectory prediction without any equipment. After all, there was finally a person who could study the Victema arcase just like Kinuan himself. Luke was sure that he had come to learn from Kinuan of his own free will, to become stronger after the incident with the servants of Kora. However, it had simply been a carefully planned outcome by the Imperials. Luke tried not to let his words confuse him. The protagonist still believed that he had met an enemy on that mission, and he simply needed to become stronger. So Luca went through all the instructors and chose the most suitable one, and that was his personal decision. Luca made his choice, but Kinuan was sure that every person in that life is someone's slave, whether he knows it or not. Surely now Luca was just trying to run away from the truth. After all, he was still too young. As he was leaving, Kinuan asked him to come back, and if he wanted, he could report everything to the chief commander. Luca found himself thinking that he couldn't believe a single word Kinuan said. But as Kinuan said, Chief Centurion Hemilus wants Luke to continue studying the arcase of Victima. The commander asked him to listen to his mind, not to be led by other people's words, not to doubt the Empire. He only needed success. Luca should not even invent something unnecessary for himself. He should not doubt anything. But Luca knew that even his thirst for success was not his own will. Simulation training room. Luke was still thinking about everything that had happened to him. He was never able to report everything that had happened to the chief centurion, Hemilus. If he had done so, he would have been tortured with psychological tests for possible infestation with a dangerous ideology. Given how confused Luca was, he was sure his scores would have been lower than before. And the Empire does not forgive those who do not share its interests. In the worst case, Luca will be demoted from the military to the working class. Luca remembered those last words of Kinuan and realized that his instructor must have known that Luca was too hesitant to report. If he wanted to convey, you need to be prepared for subsequent psychological testing. And for this it was simply necessary to meet with Ailey. After his training, Ailey suddenly found himself catching a bottle of water that someone had unexpectedly thrown at him. Luca was glad that his friend had progressed and allowed himself to be seen in a different light. Ailey was sure that the countless defeats had made him much stronger and motivated him. Ailey was flattered that Luca had come all this way to cheer him up, but Luca had one more thing to do besides that, or rather, it was a request. Luca remembered that once, Ailey said that aristocrats could pay for their places. It was actually a well-known secret, although even after training, the incompetent ones would not be able to cope with anything. Luca asked how Ailey had managed to pass the psychological testing at the first selection. Luca wanted that if Ilias had some secret way, then he needed to be initiated into it all. Ilias hoped that Luca understood how dangerous this request was. Luca checked that there was no one in the room, and he did it only for the sake of the Empire. Ailey won't ask why he needed it, but as he already understood, there really was a way. Luca was very interested to know which one, but Ailey had no choice but to tell him about it. All Luca had to do was create a perfect dummy for others and hide his real personality deep inside himself. In fact, all people hide some part of their personality deep inside themselves, and this will help him pass the psychological test. Luca didn't fully understand what Ailey was trying to say. Ailey tried to explain it all much more simply and clearly. There are cases when people lose their memory as a result of a traumatic event, so Luca just needs to do it consciously. Luca doubted that it was even possible. But then Ailey wouldn't have been able to tell you about it if it really was impossible. Ailey said that their brains lived in conditions of constant shock. If Luca continued to act like a loyal soldier, it would somehow leave the right mark on his personality for the psychological test. For 2 months before the selection, Elias had been praising the Emperor every day as soon as he woke up. He was copying his father's behavior, roughly speaking. The only problem is that your real self can be damaged by using this technique for a long time. Luca could easily even lose himself. Luca did not understand how Ailey could even think of such a thing. If the method was really that simple, then Luca wouldn't even need to pretend. He would continue to act like he always did, like someone who always got the highest score, even on a psychological test. Luca just needed to temporarily become who he was before meeting Ilay and Kinuan. Ailey still didn't know what his friend was planning, but he told him to be very careful. Anything related to psychological testing is an extremely dangerous thing. Luca never thought he would hear this from Ailey, and suddenly Luke got a call from Kinuan. They headed back to the lower sector. Kinuan warned him that they had practice today, and it was quite simple. The instructor was surprised at what a kosher building the bandits had managed to build for themselves. Luca was still surprised that even after that day, Kinuan continued to teach him as if nothing had happened, as if that conversation at the orphanage had never happened. And that made Luca even more uneasy. When they went inside, Kinuan informed him that he would only have 20 seconds. Luca's task was to kill all the bandits inside, but there was a lock with a code on the door, which Luca successfully dealt with. There were several people inside, and Luca's gaze fell on the man who was lying on the sofa. Luke calmly continued to approach the man. Luca didn't look like a visitor, so these people didn't understand what he needed. The main character was glad that one of these blockheads immediately came closer, and what's more, with a gun in his pocket. There were 3 more thugs at the poker table, and the 4th was the most menacing. It seemed that he was their leader, and in the bathroom too, someone's presence was felt. This man didn't plan to crack open children's skulls so early in the morning, but what can you do? That's life. And before he finished speaking, Luca hit him with all his might. Luca knew he'd been stressing out a lot lately. Now he just needed to let off some steam. Luca was able to knock the gun out of his hands, and it worked to his advantage while everyone else was distracted. Now Luca will definitely be able to deal with them quickly. He shot everyone except their leader, who had already shot him. But the main character was very lucky that this bandit had very poor aim. It is hard to believe that such inexperienced people dare to make a living by murder. Suddenly another worm crawled out of the bathroom to the sound of gunshots. He couldn't understand what was happening. He looked around the room, hoping to figure out why they were all making noise, and noticed that all of his partners were dead. In his place, the main character would pretend to be dead. It would be a shame to lose such precious limbs. After finishing with him, Luca felt that there was someone else in the toilet. He decided to go and check it out. It seemed there was a girl there. Coming closer, he noticed a terrifying picture. A couple of seconds later, Luca left the room altogether. He did it in almost 20 seconds. Kinuan applauded him. It was a good job. He also saved the girl. Luca wanted to go back and kill those bastards who had bullied the girl, but he shouldn't get carried away. They were guests in this place. Any unnecessary interference could disrupt the local order. In any case, this world is full of people who lack the strength to defend themselves. Luca, more than anyone, knew what usually happened to them. This girl suffered such a fate because she was unable to fight, whereas Luca desperately fought for strength so that he would never be in her place. He would have counted her among the rabble of scum who did not appreciate the opportunities provided by the Empire, but at that moment he felt disgust only for this unfair system of our society. After that, Kinuan continued to lead Luca to the lower sector. He pushed the boy into various battles without any prior information. He wasn't doing this to teach Luca how to win, but to figure out how to handle the situation he found himself in. Of course, assessing the enemy's capabilities is a basic part of any battle, but Luca needed to go much further, analyze his surroundings, and come up with the most effective plan of action. Kinuan continued to send him into battle without saying a word. Lower Town Workshop. The life of this girl saved by Luca seemed to have improved, and now she greeted them in the cafe where she worked. Her name was Gilda. Kinuan asked her to make a cup of coffee like the old days with a layer of butter, and this time, instead of milk, Luca asked for coffee, but without the butter. Luca wondered if there was any need to drop by the workshop, but he didn't seem to recognize the girl until Kinuan told him. Kinuan thought the guy should be proud to see how hard she was trying to change her life. Luca remembered this girl, whom he had recently rescued from the clutches of bandits. After listening to her story, Luca learned that she had been kidnapped and subjected to every conceivable and unimaginable horror for 6 months. But fortunately, her mind had held out, and she was able to return to everyday life. And the reason why she was kidnapped was because her friend was hiding near her house from a gang he owed money to. These bandits simply broke into her house and kidnapped her, and the friend who was the reason for all this was already a corpse. Gilda herself was from the orphanage. She was quite gifted in mechanical engineering, so Kinuan simply decided to sponsor her training. But it was anonymous, so she wouldn't know anything about it. This led Luca to believe that Kinuan had known her from the beginning. But the instructor didn't have time to answer, because another guest arrived at the workshop. It was Gabriel. He was very surprised to see Luca in this place. Gabriel asked the girl to pour him a mug of beer, but his nervous system was already suffering from numerous overloads, so he should not drink alcohol. After they saved Gilda, Kinuan introduced her to Gabriel. As a result, they agreed on a mutually beneficial cooperation. She became his mechanic, and he, her bodyguard. Luca intervened in their conversation and asked Gabriel to listen to what his mechanic was saying, but it was just beer. It would have been better to just drink some coffee, milk, or tea. And anyway, it was Luca who was wandering around the city, stirring up hornets' nests. And what was he thinking? The gang leaders had already turned against him. They had been planning to do something for a long time. If they wanted to, Gabriel couldn't even guarantee Gilda's safety. But Kinuan thought that there was no need to worry about all this. Kinuan knew that they would not appear in the lower city any time soon. Gilda decided to ask how long they would be gone. Kinuan replied that it could be a couple of months, or even years. He couldn't say for sure. It seemed to Luca that soon they would not be able to go down to the lower sector at all. Luca could not even go there of his own free will. The guards do not allow the trainees to go outside the base alone. Maybe today was the last time Luca saw them both. Even after those terrible events, Gilda was able to come to terms with reality and even began to work. She still hoped that they would be able to see each other again. But Gabriel continued his risky work in his field. Now he was thinking about suggesting a farewell party. Kinuan thought that Luca shouldn't feel sorry for them. Each of them had their own path in life. He didn't need to be able to return to this place again. This may be the best outcome for his current situation. After some time, the office of the chief centurion, Luca reported almost everything to him, and from his story, the commander concluded that Kinuan continued to act willfully. The commander said that Kinuan had become a trainee at a rather late age. Normally, people like him wouldn't even be given the chance. But sometimes even the Empire had to settle for all sorts of riffraff. After all, those were rather unsettled times. Even the commander couldn't fully understand what kind of person he was, this Kinyuan. When the commander was just starting out, Kinyuan was already a key figure in the Imperial Guard. Commander Hemilus assumed that he specialized in covert secret operations. From this, Luca realized that the records on Kinyuan were not available even to the chief centurion. In any case, it is true that Kinyuan managed to penetrate someone after so long. It turned out that Commander Hemilus had sent interns to him before, but they could not last long. The commander knew that Luca was exceptional, but at the same time, very vulnerable to negative influence. As a result, the commander decided to assign him a psychological test, and Luca had to try to pass it normally. Luca already knew that everything would be like this, so he was prepared for it. The commander was going to be frank with him. There were only 2 outcomes for the trainees assigned to this mission. Some were eliminated for the sake of secrecy, while others were transferred straight to the ranks of the Imperial Guard as a reward. And now the commander really wanted to hope that it was Luca who would be able to go by the second option. Luca was going to simply follow the orders that they would give him. If the operation was successful, Luca believed that the commander would be able to put in a good word for him. Such audacity pleased Hemilus. Of course, it was not even discussed. If Luca could show good results, the commander would personally promote him, or, to be more precise, he even wanted to adopt him. The commander named him Luca Castoria and said it sounded very cool. The main character of the DVZH could not dream of this. The chief centurion was going to make a simple orphan a member of his family. It was simply unthinkable. The Astoria family was one of the most privileged in the entire empire. Luca couldn't believe it. The employee informed him that the psychological test had already begun. And he was also able to capture the joy on his face, which means that something had happened recently in his life that could have caused this smile. But it was none of his business, and it was time to start the test. Meanwhile, Ailey trained so hard that he now often began to lubricate his prosthetic arms with oil. It would probably be easier to buy new and less expensive ones every time. Luca couldn't believe that this was the same Ailey he knew before. It seemed like he had trained until his joints were completely worn out. Ailey decided to ask him how he passed the test. Luca passed it well, thanks to Ailey. Luca saw that something had been going on with Ailey lately, and in that case, he could turn to his friend for help at any time. The thing was that Ailey couldn't share this with him yet, but he could promise that he would soon turn to him for help. If Elias felt in danger during the fight, Luca would definitely help him, even if he had to risk his own life. Elias thanked him for these words. As Ailey said, he would tell everything soon. He hoped that everything would not be as he thought. Luca would be lying if he said he wasn't interested in what kind of help Ailey wanted to ask for, but Luca wouldn't try to find out ahead of time either. Now that Luca had successfully passed the psychological testing and earned the trust of the chief centurion. During this time, the main character's goal had changed significantly, and now he intended to become the son of the Castoria family. At this time, this was the only thought that occupied his mind. From now on, all units will have to operate under the leadership of a special military unit. Its purpose was to suppress the rebels who rose up against the Empire. The rebel forces consisted of 3 families, led by the Ramones family. When he heard this name, Luca was very shocked. Lillian Ramones. Now Luca understood what Ailey wanted to ask him. On this mission, Luke led the 21st Platoon of the Suppression Army. His troop greeted him very well. To think that they would appoint a trainee to the position of platoon leader, this command actually intends to use the rebellion as a training tool. In general, the platoon was divided into 2 squads, consisting of a total of 27 people. In this squad, Luca's assistant will be the deputy platoon commander, Sergeant Kodrak. Given Luca's inexperience, the suppression army is mostly made up of seasoned veterans, and each of them knows that they are a tool for training the trainee. This means that they are unlikely to be happy with the orders of a superior whose skills they do not particularly trust. But despite this, the main character will have to act as a leader and give them any orders. But Luca didn't quite understand how to do it, and in general, he had only 2 options. The first was to leave it all to Sergeant Kodrak. Even if Luca gave an unclear order, Kodrak would sort everything out. This was the most obvious choice in this situation. And the second way was to show his superiority. Luca said that he was the main one here and no one else. So he demanded unquestioning obedience to my orders. Any disobedience would be punished. Luca chose the tactic of nipping resistance in the bud with his brute force. Sergeant Kodrak was going to talk to him. But Luke followed his plan strictly, so all his actions made sense for him to be listened to. Luca asked him how the sergeant dared to touch without permission from his superior. Was he really considered an idiot because of his age? The protagonist said he was from the lower sector, like most of those standing here, an orphan from an orphanage with a double-digit index, very young, but they should have known why there was such a big difference between their social positions. And all this happened because Luke was immeasurably superior to them all. They would soon realize it themselves. Luca would become the best platoon leader they could ever meet. Kodrak admitted that he had made a mistake. Now he promised to be more polite from now on. Luca was glad that the sergeant had adjusted so quickly. The sergeant had immediately realized that Luca would not take the easy way out. An Imperial Army outpost near an enemy fort. Ailey wasn't surprised that Luca couldn't resist and beat up one of the squad members. The protagonist simply noticed that his assistant was going to treat him like a child, and they were children in their eyes. But Luca was not to be convinced. He believed that your subordinates would not give a damn about you if you were so nice. Commander Hemilas Castoria decided to skip all formalities. He reported that the rebels had settled deep into the shrine of the mystical civilization. The magical fortress was now under their complete control, and the area was limited by a barrier. It is dome-shaped and extremely dense, so it serves as a kind of good defense. Magic turrets were also spotted, ready to shoot down any air targets. There were only 5 of these turrets. The 11th Armored Brigade was tasked with destroying them. The rest of the army would attack from different directions. The armored brigades are fully clad in fully mechanical armor. The Empire has deployed a lot of forces to suppress this rebellion. The operation was to begin at 14 hours, 10 minutes that is, in an hour and 30 minutes. All soldiers had to be ready by that time. Ailey and Luca decided to go outside and talk a little. Luca knew that their role in this battle would be just support, but it was clear from the start, because their commander didn't want them all to die from the start. And how is that any different from a picnic? Ailey noticed that Luca was grumbling like an inveterate warrior. Ailey was constantly thinking about something, and it was noticeable, as if he wanted to say something important. Ailey had already started to speak, but Luca interrupted him, asking about Ramones. They may have been close, but now Luca and Ailey can do nothing. If Ailey stands up for those accused of treason, Ailey won't be able to save even his family. In fact, Ailey did not create illusions, but if he had a chance, he would like to save at least Lillian. Luca knew that he loved her so much that he was ready to risk his life now. She was Ailey's first love. But now he no longer felt those feelings. Did Ailey really want to hook Luca with his first love now? Lillian never wanted to marry an aristocrat. Luca asked him to finally pull himself together. Luca had previously let all his antics slide, but this was already going beyond all acceptable limits. Trying to save Lillian was incredibly dangerous. Ailey would be executed on the spot if they caught him doing all this. Luca asked him for the last time not to do something stupid. Let him consider this a warning. Ailey agreed with him suspiciously easily. The damned Arcais Victima immediately allowed Luca to recognize the lie. This idiot still plans to save Lillian. And now it didn't matter whether Ailey accepted it or not, but for his sake, Lillian Ramones had to die. Luca hoped it would happen in the middle of all this chaos. He begged her not to cross paths with Ailey at any cost. The protagonist desperately wanted that. The most important things in the body are the head and chest. As long as these 2 zones are damaged, the Empire's soldiers will not die. As long as you can breathe and blood feeds your brain, the Empire will bring you back to life with cybernetics technology. Sergeant Kodrak approached Luca while he was thinking. Kodrak was well aware of his abilities. He had carefully studied his references from his superiors, but Luca still did not understand what he meant by that. Sergeant Kodrak would like to say, "When they engage in combat, please." Luke listened to his words. Kodrak has served the Empire for over a decade now, and his words will not be without meaning in any case. Kodrak may not be as gifted as Luke, but his skills are quite valuable. He didn't have to worry about that. Luca promised that he would listen to anyone if their opinion was reasonable. And that was all. Sergeant Kodrak thanked him. Meanwhile, the mission had already begun. Armored Brigade with all mechanical armor. Model Myrmidon. It was the first time Luke had seen them up close, and he was surprised that they were actually mass-produced, fully mechanical Myrmidon armor. Their task was to knock out all the turrets, and then the squads would receive the order to attack. As soon as the guards came closer, they immediately opened fire on them. But their task was to break through the dome. The guards were too quick to arrive. Their speed increased the rate at which shots were coming in. And in a couple of seconds, They were already breaking through the dome from different sides. Luca was surprised that they were able to break through the defenses of this magical fortress so quickly and successfully. Now everything depended on whether they could neutralize these turrets. If the overseers failed, this battle would be fought in much worse conditions, and everyone knew it. According to the strategy simulator's calculations, the approximate time required to destroy the turrets was 1 minute after the entire invasion. If the Myrmidon detachment fails, the suppression forces will be forced to enter as is and pay the prevailing price. The turrets were neutralized. Now it was time to move on to the next stage of the operation. The battlefield is always a brutal and dangerous place, but it is also a place where a man can enjoy a good adrenaline rush. Frankly, Luca liked it. He's the kind of person who is driven by ambition and the excitement of such events. He would have gone crazy long ago without all this. In a couple of minutes, they were already heading to the place. It was time to test their strength through the main character. The plan is to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The brass intend to clear every room so that no rebel can escape unpunished. The underground tunnels of the magical fortress are like a labyrinth. Even familiar paths go hundreds of meters deep. The squad members had maps compiled by the expedition that explored the fortress ruins, but the rebels could modify them, so they shouldn't rely on them too much either. The rebels probably narrowed the tunnels to the underground rooms so that the Myrmidon soldiers couldn't get through, but Luca's squad was already inside and conducting reconnaissance. From this point, Luca announced that he was going to go alone. Sergeant Kodrak thought it was a dangerous move in such a place. The probability of ambushes and traps was very high. Sergeant Kodrak was afraid that something would happen to Commander Luca and he would not be able to cope with the consequences. Luca understood this. He himself was often afraid of not being able to cope with the consequences. But Luca didn't care what would happen after his death. He didn't care if Kodrak's salary was cut because of it. Luke repeated that he would go first and everyone else would follow him. Kodrak felt a shiver run down his spine, as if he had already been aimed at the back. But now was not the time to worry about all that. Luca was to find and eliminate Lillian Ramones before she could meet with Eiley. Surely Eiley himself is already in the tunnels. He just entered from the other side. If he wants to get rid of the army tail, he will also break through at any cost. The protagonist could have also let his own people go to waste, but he could not allow his personal feelings to take the lives of loyal soldiers. So he was going to face the risks himself. And at that moment he heard Kodrak's voice. Luca was already swinging at the gun at that moment. Using the arcade fighting style, Luca was able to heighten his senses of sight, hearing, touch and smell to the extreme, and even taste. Catching traces of chemistry in the air with his tongue, Luca received tons of information, both useful and not so useful. His squad had been watching him the whole time. Luca could feel his arteries expanding with the crazy rhythm of his heart. The pressure on his brain allowed him to go beyond the limits of all reason. How it all irritated him. It irritated him that the soldiers were so slow. He just wanted to punch Kodrak in the face. The protagonist knew it in theory, but now he felt it on his own skin. Long-term use of Arcase Victima causes increasing damage to the brain. In that short time, Luke killed everyone who stood in his way, and his soldiers watched him. But they approached too slowly to check all the dead and not to run into something unexpected. When they came closer to Luca, he asked why they were taking so long. There was nothing for the sergeant and the squad to do in this sector, so Luca ordered them to move on. They had to try to keep up this time. Who would have known that there would be such vast spaces underground? It seems that their main line of defense was very close. But the main character has already managed to go too far. Intercepting the fleeing aristocrats there will not be much difficulty. The line of defense contained about 100 warriors, and behind them, retreating unarmed people were clearly visible. Luke could guess that Lillian was somewhere among them. Kodrak hastened to report that their detachment was advancing too quickly. He suggested that they wait for the others. It was a reasonable suggestion. Luca's brain was already overloaded from using the Arcase Victim. Suddenly, Luca heard a shot, which was most likely aimed in their direction. It seemed that there was some kind of a brawl going on there, and then Luca thought that maybe another detachment had arrived with them. Well, there was only one other person besides Luca who would be in such a hurry. Luca reported that the enemies were distracted. This was a chance to attack and defeat them. But the shields of Luca's squad would not last long. It was not yet time to give up. It was necessary to hold on. The only thing to be afraid of was a weapon that was capable of killing Luca in one shot. The Protestants had about 8 cannons with high firepower. It was necessary to wait for the moment when at least half of them were spent on reloading. Luke ordered everyone to scatter and hide in a safe place when the Protestants focused on Luke alone. The protagonist could ignore rifles and pistols. Such light attacks were not able to penetrate his armor. This meant that only he could deal with the weapon that posed the greatest threat to everyone. They wouldn't be able to fire while he was between them. Now no one can stop Luca. Many began to surrender after such an attack. After this, the platoon leader ordered all the rebels to be shackled. Luke noticed something else that made him think badly of his friend. The protagonist noticed people from Eiley's squad. Judging by all this, Eiley ordered them to attack from the rear, which means he himself simply went further, sacrificing them without even giving them a chance to regroup. He was so desperate that he was ready to sacrifice the lives of his own people. Realizing this, Luca began to hate Lillian Ramones more and more, and became more angry with Eli Karfika. Luca knew he wanted to help Elias, but he was still a soldier of the Empire. Choosing one would mean giving up the other. This situation really pissed him off. If Luca met Lillian, he would kill her on the spot. He didn't care if Eli hated him for it. At least Luca would try to save his life, not letting him become a traitor. Luca needed to find him quickly. He ordered Kodrak to continue this arrest until reinforcements arrived. He asked everyone to group up and act independently. Luca left the command to the sergeant. This caused Kodrak to turn to him. Kodrak noted that Luca was an excellent soldier. His fighting skills were not only impressive, they shocked everyone. However, he was a mediocre commander. But if Luca had not been their commander, the losses would have been much more serious. Thanks to him, they were able to achieve a lot. Then what was the essence of the sergeant's complaint? Kodrak explained that it was that Luca did not lead the people, but broke through all this time alone, relying solely on his own strength. Such methods could not make Luca a good commander. And Luca thought they had their own ineptitude to blame. Luca doubted they were capable of implementing his tactics, or even understanding them. The protagonist simply found it funny that they were whining here because he didn't use them. Kodrak believed that the day would come when Luca would need the help of those weaker than him. No one can stay on top forever. Well, if that day comes, then Kodrak will laugh, and he will even be able to reproach him for what he has already warned. He will mean this. Kodrak still hoped that his commander would change his mind. However, Luca said that he would take the advice of his first mate into consideration. If Luca came to the conclusion that his methods were wrong, he would remember Kodrak's words and reconsider his strategies. Kodrak didn't think such an inflated ego could coexist with flexible thinking, but she still wished the leader all the best. Scorched walls and empty shells, corpses of aristocrats clutching weapons unfamiliar to their delicate hands. One thing was clear, they were trying to buy time. Surely something similar could be seen in the neighboring corridors. Most of the suppression army successfully invaded and punished all the rebels. Luca had to admit one thing. He knew it sounded cliché, but Elias wasn't just someone he could rely on in a fight. He was his best friend. He was the first person Luca's age with whom he could share all his deepest thoughts as an equal. And now Eiley was simply throwing away the lives of the Empire's soldiers for his own purposes. They didn't have to die. A regular squad doesn't risk people's lives just to chase down rebels. Even if he was lucky enough to find Lillian, Luca still didn't understand how he was going to help her. She would still end up dead. Luca understood that she was his first love, but why was he going to die with her? Emotions got the better of Eiley. Walking down the hallway, Luca heard someone's voice saying that he surrendered and that he was from the Ramones family. But the main character didn't care whether he gave up or not. He was only interested in where Lillian Ramones was headed. The guy replied that he didn't know the whereabouts of the heiress. Luke noticed his pupil flicker, a common sign that someone was lying. Luke was not going to tolerate this and asked his question again. This was the last chance for that guy. It turned out she went down. But if you wanted to get out, shouldn't you have gone up? Or maybe there was another escape route that went up. This guy, unfortunately, didn't know anything. Branch members like him weren't given such details. This guy also said that he saw Eli Karfiku, who beat him up like that. Ramones was sure that Eiley had gone crazy. Even when they surrendered, he killed them all. Luca heard what he wanted from him, and so he killed him. This guy would have been executed anyway. Better for him to meet his end here than to be tortured further. Luca wouldn't say he usually felt guilty about killing people, but today he felt especially detached. He was sure that the battlefield almost always had that effect on a person. As he advanced further, he could hear more clearly the screams and shots that followed them. It was Eiley. He must have already passed the point of no return. In that case, Luca didn't know what to do now. Eiley was an important person in his life, a close friend, even if he was different in many ways, but still. Luca was always paranoid when he hung out with Eiley, so much so that he even asked himself questions. But Luca never knew the answer to the question of what to do if Elias went against the Empire. The main character constantly put off answering this question, but now he had nowhere to go. He had to meet this truth face to face. Luca was already so close to this truth that he could smell Eiley from all this blood. He knew there was very little time left. Eiley was already in sight and so close. But Eiley himself was not surprised that Luca finally came to him. He really did all this. Eiley destroyed all his subordinates because of his personal interests. Without saying anything further, Luca looked into the corner where he saw the entire main Ramones family. There was Vigo Ramones, the head of the family, and his closest relatives who had survived. Of course, Lillian was among them. Luca was angry that all this was just because of her, because of one damn woman. Eiley understood that this time Luca would not let him get away with this incident, and there was no other way out except to fight with swords. Luca had no intention of killing him. He only hoped to knock some sense into his friend. The fight was about to begin. Luca knew he had to fight Elias today. Theoretically, he would win if he didn't make any mistakes. But in a real fight, there were too many unforeseen circumstances. And it won't be possible to take him quickly either. While Eiley holds him back, the Ramones family will be able to escape. He should have just killed them first, and let Eiley hate him to the core after that. Then at least Luke won't have his blood on his hands. And then it suddenly dawned on him that Eiley might want to run away with Lillian. A regular pistol won't stop Luca, and trajectory prediction allows you to aim with precision like in slow motion. However, before today's mission, Luke increased the speed and frequency range of the cybernetic signals. As a result, Eiley will not be able to stop him with a normal shot. The rest of the Ramones family had already taken aim at Luca, and Eiley saw this and shouted for them to move away from Luca. Eiley even shot at them. His bullet was flying straight to where Luca was. She was already approaching, but during this time the main character managed to kill almost everyone. When the bullet flew too close, Luca aimed it at the second attacker. And then he got so close to Vigo that he killed him too. In doing so, he was able to kill Lillian's mother as well. And now only Lillian Ramones remains. Luca had plenty of time to kill her, even if Eiley caught up with him soon. Lillian Ramones is the girl who once came to him with an offer to date. Luca will never be able to forget her until he can completely get rid of the guilt for her death. Luca promised her that her death would be painless. That was the most he could offer her. At that moment, the main character looked at her and saw that she was smiling. Eiley knew he wouldn't be able to save her in time, so he simply shouted Luca's name. This stopped Luca for a second and Eiley was able to reach him. Luca wanted Eiley to see how his beloved had fun when all her relatives were dead. It was not surprising. After all, she was finally free from their influence. They had always treated her only as an instrument for concluding a marriage contract. Luca didn't know what kind of nonsense Eiley was trying to explain to him. Luca only asked him to stop his senseless resistance. This woman was a traitor anyway. Luca knew nothing. The families accused of treason never rebelled against the Empire. It was just an excuse to get rid of everyone. Didn't the protagonist find it strange how flimsy the traitors' defenses were for those who had planned treason against the Empire? If they really intended to rebel against the Empire and the Emperor, they would have contacted Bellato or Kora instead of trying to fight with only their own forces. Luca realized how blind he had been, and it felt strange to admit it now, but Eiley was right. It was not easy to invade the magic fortress, but everything went too smoothly. For the three families planning a coup, their forces were too small. If they were truly planning a rebellion, Bellato or Kora would gladly provide them with reinforcements to successfully overthrow the Empire. But even if it was true, Luca didn't understand what it would change for all of them. At this rate, Eiley would simply die along with Lillian Ramones. Lillian looked at Luke as if she could read all his thoughts. And then she started talking about how her father was far from an innocent lamb. He hid the fact that he was studying an ancient artifact. Eiley thought that now was not the time for Luca to find out. The reason why the Empire turned against her family was quite simple. It was an ancient relic. Thanks to it, the Ramones family was able to control this ancient fortress. Luca still couldn't understand why she decided to tell him all this. Lillian knew that he didn't kill her only because of guilt. She knew that he didn't kill her only because Eiley would have hated him. Luke should have realized by now that the Empire was not allowing Elias to live the life he dreamed of. But there is one choice that would suit them all. With this thing, you can activate the teleportation device in the underground part of the fortress. This path will help to break free from the shackles of the Empire. Lillian wanted Luke to believe her. The protagonist couldn't believe that everything was so serious, and he didn't know about the existence of a teleportation device. Yes, the Ramones family installed one in the tunnels. It seems to be an escape route in case the fortress itself falls. Luca could kill Lillian if he thought she was lying. Lillian wouldn't want to watch Elias die trying to protect her either. But if they could activate the teleportation device with this ancient relic, then they can escape from this empire. And Luke will just have to say that he saw nothing. Did they really think that the Imperials hadn't already captured the teleportation device? Lillian was sure that only a direct descendant of Ramones could know the way there. Deep underground, they should be safe. For the main character, it was all very tempting, but he didn't care whether Lillian died or not. But for Eileen's sake, he is ready to try to find the best way out of this situation. He always wanted to break out of the Empire, and his descent would sooner or later lead him to very big trouble, especially since they are on the battlefield, where it is easy to cover up tracks, and declaring a friend dead or missing is not a problem. In that case, Eileen had to promise him that if the teleportation device that Lillian spoke of didn't work, or didn't exist at all, then he wouldn't interfere with Luca. He heard her words. Lillian didn't want him to suffer because of her, and therefore she would have to be killed. Eileen looked at her. It was hard for him to accept this, but he promised. And now Luke could help them both. Luca knew he had screwed up big time. Not only had he failed to stop Elias, but he had also protected the traitor Lillian Ramones. If anyone saw them, they were doomed. Luca thought this teleportation device was complete nonsense. While he was thinking about all this, Lillian asked him to stop. Lillian discovered that Eileen needed to wipe away the blood before it dried. The protagonist noted that they would be very lucky if they could get out. In that case, why don't they get married? After these words, Eileen removed Ramones' hand from his face. Lillian began to apologize to Eileen because she really couldn't even imagine that everything would turn out like this. It was nothing. It was she who told him about the device of teleportation of the outer world. Lillian did not understand that all this was only because of such a trifle, but for Eileen himself, this is not a trifle. It completely turned his worldview upside down. Thanks to her, he understood the source of his disappointment. If she hadn't been there, he would have gone crazy long ago. Eileen understood a lot. He was never strange. He was just different. Luke realized that it was Lillian who had nurtured Eilea's irreconcilable ideals. If they start spreading among the people like a contagion, the Empire will be stricken from within. If these ideas are allowed to spread, the Empire will fall, although Bellato and Kora can attack much earlier. Luke did not want the Empire to fall. If necessary, he would have to eliminate any potential threat with his own hands, even Elias himself. Luca was able to admit that he too was in some way a dissenter, just like Eileen. After walking a little more, they decided to catch their breath. Lillian said that this road was known only to her. Everything here was arranged like a labyrinth, so it would not be so easy to find them. Her father had reported nothing that was not required to allow exploration of the ruins. His ambitions had been beyond his capabilities when he had figured out how to activate the fortress, and the Emperor's iron hand had intercepted them. Now Luca was more interested in how much longer they had to go, but they should be there soon. There was only a little bit left to the end of the corridor. Lillian thanked him for helping Elias and her. Luca was simply indebted to him. He promised that if he met her again, he would kill her on the spot. They were already approaching the right door, and so Luca asked Eileen to take care of himself. Lillian interrupted Eileen and began to speak. That if she got out, then go to the border town. She offered to meet there if she and Eileen suddenly missed each other. Lillian asked Luca if he wanted to leave the Empire too, but he wasn't interested. Eileen was thinking about ending up in a border town too, but he said these words as if tasting them. Luke was already too exhausted. The decision to help Elias could be a huge mistake made in the heat of the moment, but it was no longer time to retreat. He needed to think about what Luca would tell his superiors once the mission was completed. The only positive thing is that Luca is in good standing with the chief centurion, and only he could continue to spy on Instructor Kinnuan. Eileen and Lillian are just an intern and an aristocrat. There is nothing outstanding about them. Luca thought that they wouldn't interrogate him too much. Soon they were already at those very doors. Luca asked Eileen to get ready, because if there was no teleportation device there, then he himself knew what should be. Eileen knew that it would all end soon. As soon as Luca touched the door, he was suddenly overcome by a very strange premonition. He needed to figure out the reason for his worries very urgently. He knew for sure that the answer to everything was behind this door. There is nothing strange about it being so bright inside. After all, activating the fort automatically turns on the lights everywhere. You need to block out all your senses and focus only on the smells. The first thing Luca distinctly smelled was the smell of blood, then the smell of machine oil and iron parts. But he didn't smell people. These were the Imperial Guards, and Eileen's words stuck loudly in his head. It was all over.
Luke was very shocked by this.
And now Luke would have to risk his life to deal with even one unarmed Imperial Guard, and he sensed 4 at once. The worst thing would be if they decided to take Lillian alive. She hadn't trained like he and Eileen, so she would quickly give in under torture and tell everything. In that case, the authorities would find out about their amateur activities. The protagonist thought he would help them get out so that Eileen could live the life he dreamed of, but it was just a stupid fantasy. There was only one way out now. He had to deal with Lillian, here and now. Suspicions might arise, of course, but at least he could come up with a worthy excuse to his superiors. But would Eileen be able to remain calm if he witnessed her death with his own eyes? And if he decided to attack the guards, they were all doomed. All the guards were looking at him now. It was time to run away. Luca knew that the longer he hesitated, the more questions they would have. It's now or never. And at that moment someone shot at her himself. It was Eileen's pistol. He killed her himself. One of the guards asked what the shot was for. Eileen responded before Luca could come to his senses. He said that he had carried out the sentence on the hostage, who was no longer of any use. The guards did not understand why they had taken her with them at all. Eileen had to report, because all further actions depended on his words. Luke still stood motionless and looked after Eileen. The main problem was also fixed by Elias himself. Luca couldn't understand why.